Welcome to the chaos sector. The Matrix has a virus, and it's spreading at a rapid pace. This virus is currently spreading in the form of so-called mass shootings. Soon after the Nashville hoax, another sprouted out in Louisville, Kentucky. An individual entered a bank and simply shot up the place. Seems quite nonchalant when I put it that way, right? Well, apparently that's how easy it is. Let's break down the so-called breaking news. Now before we get into the segment, guns in America? Really? We have to focus on the political component of this garbage. Don't misunderstand, I'm not calling the issues of guns in America garbage, I'm calling the mainstream media's narrative garbage. ABC is a left-wing outlet, and their agenda is to push the narrative that Republicans provoke these so-called mass shootings. Let's not forget this. Although ABC is very subtle in how they attack the right, they perhaps are more malicious. Let me also mention this, as many may be wondering. The reason we focus on the left-wing media more is because they often display overt deception. It's so vile and blatant, we can't help but expose them first. But we do not let the right-wing media off the hook, it's just that you have to dissect them more meticulously. I'll get into that later.
We begin with that deadly mass shooting in Louisville, Kentucky. A fifth victim has now died after a gunman opened fire inside a bank conference room yesterday. 8 other people were injured. We're also learning the shooter was employed by the bank and killed by police, and that he planned and live streamed the attack.
Walks into a bank, which has security cameras everywhere, before even entering the bank, then heads into a conference room, which means he had to travel past the commons area, with no resistance from a security guard? Banks are more secured than any other company in a community. Keep in mind, he is carrying an assault rifle, this is not a handgun. Meaning, you can't conceal this weapon. Also meaning, he had to have been spotted prior to even walking into the bank with the weapon, right? The security guard is designated to secure the entrance of the bank. Did he get shot? We will find out who the so-called victims were. Something tells me it wasn't the security guard.
The police chief providing more details earlier today.
We have also learned that he purchased the weapon used in this tragic incident on yesterday, on April the 4th. He purchased the weapon legally from one of the local dealerships here in Louisville.
How did you learn that he purchased the assault rifle at a dealership? You tracked the weapon to that dealership after identifying him? Okay, now if you did all of that extensive work in tracking the weapon, how are these so-called mass shootings continuing to happen? The dealership would provide the authorities with his information, and yet that same dealership isn't required to do a background check on individuals before they purchase guns? Now you may say, this is why the so-called mass shootings keep happening. But if you were to suggest that, then you would also have to suggest that the federal government is allowing it to keep happening. Since so-called mass shootings could be considered a national crisis, similar to another so-called crisis that occurred in 2020, shouldn't the federal government require all gun sellers to perform background checks, the way the same federal government shut down the majority of companies due to a virus? It's the same life-threatening dynamic, and it's mainly so-called centered around children as victims. Does this add up? No, it doesn't. It's not rocket science, a background check is not complicated for law-abiding citizens. I'm sure Congress doesn't have a problem with national background checks on both sides, right?
We have executed a search warrant on his residence, and we have recovered items, and we cannot get into specific details on what we recover at this time because, again, the investigation is ongoing.
Boubet on the ground there in Louisville following the story for us. She joins me live now. So, Faith, this is more than 24 hours since this deadly mass shooting. What else are we learning?
Well, Alexis, one of the most chilling things we learned during that news conference this afternoon is the fact that the shooter allegedly warned someone. They called someone before this shooting.
Who is this someone? They claim he called someone, right? Now here's why the mainstream media is so deceptive in how they report. If you know he called someone, this means you know exactly who it is. The authorities searched his cell phone, saw who he called either moments before the so-called shooting or earlier, and they contacted that individual. This information should not be vaguely reported in the news. It's not to protect the identity of anyone associated with him, because those people end up making public statements anyway. So why do they give these vague reports? Because they build up the script with each news segment and spoon-feed the information to the public, who all want to know who that person was, glued to those news networks, anticipating the identity of the individual to be revealed. Hence, psychological operations.
This happened, of course, we don't know the timeline in terms of when it happened, whether it's right before the shooting or weeks before, but we know that this shooter allegedly either called or texted at least one person. He allegedly indicated to that person that he was suicidal and contemplating harm.
Notice the stuttering? This is because this reporter is lying. They know exactly the timeline, because the very fact that you know he called someone is accompanied by a timeline via phone records. This is what the authorities collected. After the so-called shootout, they confiscated the weapon from the shooter, searched him, found his cell phone, and bingo, did a scan on the phone, and discovered he called that someone. Why claim you don't know the timeline, when you do? Well, the timeline is associated with who, how, when, where, and why. These questions would follow based on the timeline of the communication between the so-called shooter and the someone, which potentially puts them in a compromising position, which also compromises the entire hoax. They will eventually identify that person, but by that time, the story would have gotten stale in the mainstream media. In a hoax, they can't provide a consistent and coherent report. It's impossible.
But officials say there's really no Kentucky law right now in the books to deal with a situation like that. We also learned this afternoon that officers executed a search warrant, and I think it's worth repeating from what the chief just said. They were at the shooter's home shortly after that shooting here yesterday, and they removed a lot of items that they're going through that evidence right now. Officials are, of course, calling this a targeted shooting because the suspect actually knew each of these victims. He worked with them for years. He actually started here as an intern and had been promoted a few times. And, of course, two former bank employees we talked to said that, he was friendly. They had no idea that he would do something like this. They said that he was an avid sports fan and really didn't see anything that would indicate any kind of red flag in terms of committing such a gruesome act.
Incorrect. This wasn't someone having an angry rant at work due to stress. That can happen. This was someone who so-called massacred human beings. He purchased an assault rifle, planned his attack, and went into the bank and so-called murdered many people. Trust me, there were red flags somewhere. This person is a psychopath, and psychopaths can't hide their, insanity. It will show somewhere, somehow, through human interaction. It could be anger, very hostile towards coworkers, remarks, eye contact, lack of direct eye contact, lack of direct communication. Something would have been identified as a sign, which would be distinct opposed to common behavior. The way his coworkers described him contradicts the psychopath he would be. The narrative pushed is someone could appear normal, but are one tick away from shooting up a bank. That is not reality. This type of person would show signs of a mental illness. It doesn't just, quote, appear out of thin air. A mental illness would exist, and their family, friends, or spouse would know about it. They would be treated for this mental illness, as those close to them want them to get better. The point, he was never normal to anyone or everyone around him.
ABC News also learned that the shooter recently found out that he was about to be fired. We're not sure exactly how close to the shooting when that was supposed to happen.
Okay, yeah. So he decides to so-called massacre coworkers and innocent people in the bank because he was going to be terminated? His dreams shattered. He could never work in the banking industry again. His life is over. If I'm not mistaken, this individual was in his mid-20s. A young banker gets terminated? No problem, find another job at another bank, right? Perhaps a better bank. But why would they terminate him when he had previously received several promotions? Seemed they put a lot of trust and support into him, right? Termination is based on something the employee did or didn't do. No details of that termination, but once again, the news discovered he would be terminated. They got this information from the bank. But what are the details of the termination? Always leaving a gray area for people to plug the holes to. It's a clever way of presenting the stereotypical white rage to their viewers. Just claiming he would be terminated pushes the narrative that he was so distraught over it, he decided to commit suicide and also take others with him because his, quote, white male success was being destroyed. Notice the difference in how they allude to this being the motive, but in the Nashville hoax, they didn't reveal the manifesto to the public. One is to subliminally castigate the white male, while the other, although the individual identified as a white male, they are a part of the transgender community. So they don't provide a motive, their race is actually irrelevant. But let's go back to the authorities' press conference to show you what I mean.
Deceased. This is the only time that I will mention the suspect name in this case. The suspect has been identified as white male, 23 years of age.
The name is not important in this press conference, the race is what they wanted the public to focus on. That is the narrative they want to push in this hoax, white rage. The previous so-called mass shooting was met by criticism from the right regarding transgenders. The left couldn't avoid that criticism if it was based on being a hate crime against Christians. So, another hoax is drummed up, and this one fits right into the left's wheelhouse of identity politics. Cenk Yogurt yapped about it, of course.
How about all the straight white males? How about all of them? Giving in to them is very dangerous, like that lunatic J.D. Vance.
But investigators say that he purchased that gun on April 4th, 6 days before that shooting. It was legally purchased from a local dealership, and now because of the way the laws are written here in Kentucky, that gun will likely end up on the streets again. It will be auctioned off with the proceeds going to police.
That is hard to believe. I hadn't heard about that Kentucky law.
So the gun that was used in a so-called mass shooting will be circulated back into the market to be purchased again? Why don't you destroy it? Disassemble it, as that specific weapon has many innocent lives claimed by it? Or, if you won't destroy it, give it to the military, right? Which brings up an interesting question: if the authorities confiscate the weapon, how could it be auctioned off? This would mean the authorities would sell the weapon to auctioneers, then also receive proceeds from it? Don't they feel a bit guilty for receiving financial compensation from a weapon sold that was used in the so-called mass shooting? If the weapon ends up in the hands of another wacko, and they commit another so-called mass shooting, shouldn't the Louisville Police Department be held accountable for it? And it's not just the state of Kentucky that does this. When guns are confiscated by authorities, where do you think they end up? Similar to vehicles that are repossessed or homes that are foreclosed, it all goes back on the market. The difference, though, is guns that are used to commit crimes should be tagged for government property. These guns will then be, quote, refurbished, then available for federal government agents or the military. That would be the right thing to do, instead of circulating the gun back into the society that used it in a so-called mass shooting. But, what do I know?
This is for those who are keeping count, it is disturbing to say that this is the 15th mass shooting in the U.S. this month. So, Faith, just break down these troubling numbers for us.
Yeah, it was quite remarkable hearing officers, officials from police to the mayor to the medical officer being very blunt about what needs to happen in the wake of the shooting in terms of gun reform. They say that they're weary, they're tired, they're heartbroken, and that this level of violence is beyond anything.
And then they have the nerve to speak about how many so-called mass shootings have taken place? I think we're starting to see the problem here. The guns are circulating in society because the police departments are too busy fattening their pockets and selling the guns to auctioneers. Those auctioneers then sell them to citizens and gun store owners, who of course sell them to the citizens. Maybe they should do research on where the assault rifles in the so-called mass shootings are coming from, right? I would assume that if you track its path to its origin, it has blood on its barrel. Meaning, the assault rifle was, quote, used before, and the gun auctioneers won't notify the customer about it, they just want to sell the damn thing. Kinda like the police department, instead of doing the right thing, by passing the assault rifle over to the federal government, they hand it over to auctioneers, who will only throw it back into society. So we have the federal government who won't pass a law that requires mandatory background checks for purchase of assault rifles. We have the police departments who sell the assault rifles of a so-called mass shooting to auctioneers, only to be sold back to potential wackos due to no mandatory background check for that purchase. Yeah, expect more so-called mass shootings.
We heard from the Louisville mayor, Craig Greenberg, who tells ABC News, we have to take action.
Oh really? The mayor oversees the police department. Well, look at this, seems like someone has a bit of dirt on their hands. Or even, blood. This same mayor has held a press conference about gun violence in America after the so-called mass shooting. But how is this? You are allowing the same gun to circulate back into society. Can you explain to me, how do you propose to end gun violence if you're contributing to the potential of it happening again? And that police department you oversee receives a financial kickback for selling the weapon? Wow. What do you expect with corrupt politicians? This is the chaos sector.